Together with Jakub Kalenský, Roman Osadchuk is the author of a fascinating paper, How Ukraine Fights Russian Disinformation, Beehive versus Mammoth. This detailed and compelling work forms the basis for today's interview. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to help new people find the incredible speakers who give their time to create this material. And if you enjoy the content, please do write a comment. It helps in the algorithm, and definitely check out the validated Ukrainian charities that you'll see in the description of the video. Roman Osadchuk is a research associate for Eurasia at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. Roman researches disinformation narratives and technology uses for their spread in the region. He's interested in the role of information policy and media cycle in the spread of disinformation. Before joining the Digital Forensic Research Lab, he held several positions in Ukraine Crisis Media Center, where he was involved in communications of decentralization reform. Roman received a Master's in Public Administration degree from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs of Syracuse University, where he focused on information policy. Roman, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be here.
And I was looking through the paper. I mean, we'll come to that in a minute because it's an absolutely fascinating paper. But you conducted a whole load of interviews to form the basis of some of this research. And I'm very gratified to see that about half a dozen of the people who are on this channel also featured in your research. But it also gives me a lot of new names, perhaps, to follow up with. How important was it for you to actually get these insights from some of the most critical thinkers in this area of countering disinformation?
Yeah, so we interviewed 22 people and organizations, including this list, ranging from governmental bodies, civil society organization, media, and and private businesses. It was really important to talk to people who are in this fight for years already, right? Some of those people that we interviewed were on the front line since annexation of Crimea and the Revolution of Dignity. So when it all started, and they could actually evaluate how Ukraine moved towards being more efficient in fighting Russian disinformation. Because initially we tried to focus on the lessons after the full-scale invasion, right? So what to do and how to repel disinformation after the actual attack. But it actually ended up being a reflection on the experience of 10 years and who would be the best source to actually talk about this and get the lessons for other countries from than the people who are actually done this with their own hands, right? Publishing stories, debunking Russian narratives, and monitoring media space of Ukraine and neighboring countries for years. So that's why it was extremely important to talk to those people, to understand their new approaches, what changed, what worked, what didn't work, and what they thought were the most important things to actually replicate in other countries as well. So what might be useful for other countries so that they would not waste time and opportunities for doing something that might not work.
And that raises an interesting question, doesn't it? That this, and I think you talk about this in the report, that there is no silver bullet, there is no one single solution, and actually it's more of an arms race. What perhaps worked a few years ago may not work now, and actually having overlap between different initiatives is not necessarily a problem at all. So how far is this reflected in the kind of interviews you did, covering a full spectrum of the counter-disinformation ecosystem?
This is one of our lessons. So that you first of all need to bring numbers, right? Resources like human resources, time, money, everything to actually effectively counter it. But as you rightfully said, there is no such a wonderful thing like magic pill or bullet that would actually solve all of the problems immediately, right? Because what is actually happening is that Russians are trying to exploit new modes in new ways to actually influence influence people from other countries, including Ukraine, but also other countries as well, and they will develop their tools because it's never-ending game of seek and catch, or kind of like that, because they will develop something new. We would build defenses, they would try to come up with some new ideas, and that's why we need to adapt and rebuild our defenses. So that's why overlap comes like as another lesson, extremely important, because by having a lot of actors actually working and monitoring information space and working into the field, they could actually be better prepared and suited at actually catching new instances and more instances of Russian influence. Because again, even if we add up all of the efforts that Ukraine puts in it, it would be still far less than Russian investment in their propaganda machine, RT and Sputnik. So this is the only official things that we know, right? And if we count some other, I don't know, people who are working on the governmental contracts, but that are not that actually widely advertised, there would be, I don't know, times more maybe. So it is impossible to match this financially. That's why we need to be more creative. And that's why this network of people who are working simultaneously on different things matters. Because even if they actually repeat some of the research, it makes it more robust, more trustworthy, and actually this kind of it helps in a way so that if there is one of the organizations experiences denial of service attacks or some other things that they cannot write and publish, there will be always a safety net of other organizations that could actually pick up the slack and continue their effort to counter Russian efforts.
So, of course, Ukraine is investing a lot, given the size of the economy, investing a lot in countering disinformation. Is it true to say that many Western countries are not yet reaching that kind of scale of investment or taking it seriously enough? And how important is scale here? I mean, you say Russia has a vast amount of resources in order to invest in this disinformation, and it does so around the world. With different techniques and different narratives. We know from Global South, Africa, and so on, they will vary that narrative. If you have an entity like Ukraine or others that have far less resources, can you equalize that difference through agility, decentralization, creativity, humor? Are there ways to sort of offset that disparity in investment?
Yeah, that's basically the way, right? So you cannot, because you cannot match it, right? And even if you match it, there are still some things that need to be done, right? You need to understand what you need to counter, maybe do something proactively. So it's not, again, a silver bullet. That's why you need to adjust. So getting to the first half of the question, right, about the Western countries. A lot of countries do not perceive disinformation as a great of the problem. I mean, there are discussions on the public sphere that this is a great problem that brings some that might bring some issues to the countries, right, and damage their their democratic institutions like elections, for instance. But there is not that much action is taken. Compared to what Ukraine is doing, it's actually like in a smaller scale, in far smaller scale, honestly. So that's why I would say that it is not a lesson per se in our paper, but this is like kind of between lines, is that other countries need to understand that this is a problem and it needs to be taken care of, right? So other countries need to take it seriously because if they should understand that Russia perceives information space as a domain of waging war rather than marketplace of ideas or trade or cooperation. So this is the basics. And then getting back, so how to offset this difference, right? So that Russia invests millions more. So as you said, indeed, creativity, different approaches to monitoring. So establishing different systems of monitoring so that they would be versatile and they would catch sometimes redundant things, right? But at the same time, they might catch something else. plus having people in different regions, because a lot of these disinfo campaigns, they are extremely localized, so that having people in different regions actually looking into these things might be also helpful. Humor is a fantastic thing that seems an odd thing to mention, but honestly, it's an extremely effective tool in Ukrainian toolbox. So since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there are, I don't know, Twitter storms and Twitter accounts of people who are actually mocked Russia. And Russians do not like being mocked at all. It actually undermines their power and actually ridicules them, makes them angrier, and kind of undermines their message. And that's the whole point. Because humor, it is not only the thing of, I don't know, attacking Russians and mocking them. It's also a way and a tool to promote the stories of what's happening on the ground to bigger audiences, because they will read this more likely than some gruesome coverage. There are different audiences, so the humor will reach more people. And finally, humor is extremely important in Ukraine as well as a coping mechanism. People are sharing memes just to survive, like literally psychologically, because living through the war, shellings, air raid alerts, and everything, memes are just helping to I don't know, to keep up with this. So I would say, yeah, we need to be more creative. We need to find some better like more tools that will do our efforts at scale and actually be more efficient and effective and more creative than Russians.
Well, let's look at humor in the context of decentralization and your analogy that Russian propaganda is a bit like a mammoth, and the Ukrainian effort is much more like a sort of a beehive, but rather than bees that are a bunch of drones all performing the same sort of routine tasks, actually what seems to be happening is decentralization leads to a lot of innovation, a lot of different methodologies. How important is it for a technique like humor that it is decentralized? It seems to me that the mammoth approach will not produce things that are inherently funny. Whereas what you actually need is something that's far more organic, values-based, and decentralized to almost call it a citizen army, a little like sort of NATO, if you've been sort of following that distributed, humor-led effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Ukrainian kind of scene of counter Russian disinformation is indeed a lot of small actors. That's why this Beehive thing. And when the full-scale attack happened, more people actually joined the fight, because they were sitting in their basements, in shelters with their laptops, and like, we just want to help with something. And they self-organized in smaller groups, and some of them just informed what was happening in different languages. Some of them were filming what's happening, like their experiences, right? So it was important. Some others tried to message Russians and tell them what their government is doing, because they believed that Russians didn't know. Spoiler, it didn't work. But actually, what is important in this is that people indeed self-organized, and there was no top-bottom approach, right? There were no vertical. There was only like groups that coordinated horizontally, and this is extremely and crucially important, because, as you said, in vertical system, I don't know, ordering somebody to do funny content literally won't work. We could see this by what Russian embassy is posting from time to time. Maybe some people think that this is funny, but most of the time people are just outraged with what was published there. And this is the thing, right? This is the problem of the centralized approach. When there is someone or somebody ordering to do something, people will not be creative. They will not make their best effort to do this thing kind of, I don't know, viral, we could say. But because people are independent and they want to help, and they are really, really, I don't know, wanted to promote specific content or mock Russians, they would bring out more creativity and more I don't know, wonderful ideas and more creative ones and funnier ones, right? And that's the whole point. When you have this a lot of small groups, they are like kind of competing with each other, but this is positive competition because the objective is single for all of them.
And I don't know if you watch the work of Pekka Kaliniemi on his Vatnik soups, which are fantastic. It's been on the channel a couple of times. He compares Russian propaganda to a fire hose of falsehood. And that suggests not just a volume output, but also an immediacy and a frequency. It seems that the traditional media is really not geared up to actually tackle that, because if you have to check both sides, fact check, rely on corroboration from multiple sources, etc., you've already missed the window of publishing a story that might counter that. So how important do you think counter disinformation is to distinguish itself from traditional media approaches and to react at scale and very quickly to the emergence of disinformation?
That's a great question and quite complicated one because there is always a balance, right? Indeed, falsehood, fire hose of falsehoods. It's like Russian approach to throw as much as possible of as many things as possible in hope that something sticks. So that's basically, yeah, that's their approach. I absolutely agree. Um, the the problem with that is that you cannot debunk everything effectively and fast, right? Simply because like it's just producing some false story. It's literally seconds of like right now, maybe minutes to craft an image, to craft a specific message, run an ad campaign, like doppelganger campaign. You probably heard about it. This when websites are impersonating real media and publishing some negative stories there. So it's not extremely complicated to do nowadays. But to counter it, I mean, sometimes in some really extreme periods of time, governmental and civil society organizations need to debunk as fast as possible. Uh, if we look at the period of time in Russian-Ukraine war that was extremely important, is January, February 2022. I'll just remind you that there were a bunch of false flag operations trying to find casus belli from Russians. They were like every other week there were news that Ukraine, I know, blew up some FSB building near the border. Ukraine is about to attack Donbass or attack Russia or something else. So the government needed to debunk it like within minutes, like within an hour or two, because before it was too late. And actually, it was quite effective because Russians do not have casus belli. They attacked without it. There was no like some specific pretense that they used, right? So, but at other times, I mean, it won't work. Every agency and country should perceive what's their threshold of popularity or virality of a specific message or narrative that they need to decide upon, and then think whether they need to react or not. Right. So, and it should be different for every other country and for the specific situation. Again, if there is something critical when there is one country is literally searching for reasons to attack you, you need to debunk everything as fast as possible. Even as small, even if it's like, I don't know, 2 likes at the moment that you saw it, right? Or like one share or something. But when it is like more regular times, then this threshold should be like higher, right? But you still need to understand when would you react, when would you step in, but at the same time, organizations and governments need to be cautious about the thing called oxygen of amplification. So in order not to promote some stories that are like minor and small and that would die out on their own, and not to give them boost to promote them more. So that's a tricky and extremely complicated question, honestly, how to deal with it. But the balance should be done by people who are working this. That's their discretion and their decision in every specific case.
This idea of amplifying propaganda rather than effectively tackling it is a kind of an interesting one. Um, is that especially tricky when you think of another technique, which is pre-bunking, which is, anticipating the kind of propaganda narratives that may arise from, certain situations and their likely outcomes. For instance, there was quite a bit of pre-bunking prior to the full-scale invasion, where Western security services, especially US, UK, released information saying, no, this invasion is going to happen. This is where Russian forces are amassing, trying to destroy propaganda fictions before they are actually propagated. But that also, that's a fine line, isn't it? Because pre-bunking could actually amplify certain stories that may not get as much oxygen as they otherwise would.
You're absolutely correct. But the pre-bunking is extremely great tool in Ukrainian toolbox. So let's start from the intelligence briefs that you said. They were extremely crucial, right? Because they kind of threw off Russian, I don't know, preparation, and they basically predicted every other step that they've done at the beginning. So that was a great thing that allowed to be more effective and efficient into actually countering attack at the beginning. But pre-bunking by itself was also used by Ukrainian government agencies that work in countering disinformation. There are two institutions in Ukraine that are doing this. Center for Strategic Communications under Ministry of Culture, and Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council. So they issued sometimes they issue reports claiming that in the next week or two, Russians will launch deepfake video of President Zelensky, for instance, right, or Zaluzhny. And you know what? Yes, in a few weeks, indeed, there is a video of really poor quality, not gonna lie, extremely poor quality, but there is the video. So this is kind of prepares people for it. Also, we need to understand that a lot of the debunking that was done by Ukrainian civil society organizations, that was done like in these years, like literally 10 years as of now, right? Of the stories and usual narratives that Russians are actually using against Ukraine, they also serve as kind of pre-bunking, right? Because all of this pile of information actually could prepare people that, yeah, that if the story repeats that, that probably it is also propaganda. But the problem, as you mentioned, indeed might arise that we are telling something that Russians wanted to promote afterwards. But I would say if it is done smartly, and if it is compelling story why it is not true what would be published, then it might work like an inoculation, because it is not that we are spreading this information and claiming that this is true. It's something like a vaccine that you are doing in order not to get sick, right? So that's I would say that it's still extremely important. Of course, you should not do this every I don't know, for every message out there. Again, there should be a specific threshold, but I don't know, impersonating the head of state or like some major officials, that should be always, I would say, pre-bunked. Some other more strategic things also as well, but not the local messages that, I don't know, regular disinfo that they're throwing every other day.
Another interesting series of recommendations in your report, one of them actually goes far beyond, I would say, the informational warfare. And it says, look, if you're going to tackle this effectively, you also need to go after the physical infrastructure that enables these narratives to be propagated, that you need to target agents of influence, Russian assets abroad, whether it's in academia, and also to more robustly tackle people who may have been either directly influenced by narratives beneficial to the Kremlin, or follow the money and see if certain academics and advisors might actually have some kind of financial interest. So how important is this sort of real world follow-up, tearing out the infrastructure of propaganda narratives, root and branch?
Yeah, we should understand that Russians are using different modes of operation in multiple countries, right? So in Ukraine, there were a few iterations when there were different Russian outlets were banned. So social media in 2017, then pro-Kremlin media in 2021, and Russian TV channels in 2014. Why it was extremely important? Because this is literally sources of Russian propaganda and disinformation that influences your citizens. It might seem counterintuitive because it might infringe freedom of speech, but countries should understand that RT and Sputnik, they are not media in classical sense. They are military outlets, and people who are work there receive medals from Russian Ministry of Defense themselves for the participation in military action. So, I mean, people should understand that they are information actors. So this is extremely crucial, right? So as of now in European Union, RT and Sputnik are actually limited. So it was a great decision. So the Russians are trying to use new modes of operation, but in other countries and parts of the world, they are still active. RT Arabic or RT in Spanish, they are extremely effective in their regions where they operate. So by stopping these outlets, you would actually limit the spread of this information and make it marginalized and make it harder. So that's basically the whole thing, that you cannot stop Russian disinformation fully. It is impossible, especially now because the world is interconnected, right? And any message or idea could travel at the speed of light. But this way, you could limit and make it smaller in scale, right? Because they would need to come up with some creative ideas to go through social media, create these doppelganger websites, for instance, or something else. So this is extremely crucial. And it is not only about shutting down or closing the media, right? It is also about naming and shaming. So if there is like connection to Russia, or when there is like direct financement by Russians, then yeah, it should be just made public, right? Like some social media platform do this, like this is Russia affiliated media or something like that. So, but just by flagging that, you could just make people realize who would see this type, like part of the content, to understand that maybe this was pro-Russian content or paid for by Russians or connected to Russians. So the effect of this type of this content would be lesser than.
And it seems quite clear that Russia has considered itself involved in an informational war, if not a global war, since long before the full-scale invasion. But is it also true that many in the West, including key decision makers, have only really started paying attention to this problem during the period of the full-scale war, when in fact, perhaps 2014 is the time when really more attention and investment was required? Is there a degree of catching up that the West needs to do, catching up with Ukraine and the sort of techniques and experience that Ukrainians have in developing these counter methodologies to disinformation? And to some extent, are we still half asleep to the fact that we are in a full-scale global informational war with Russia?
First of all, yes, it is indeed informational war that is happening, and Russians are attacking other countries. I would say that the world, like, first wake-up call was in 2016, but for Ukraine it happened earlier. So, but for the world it was U.S. elections, right? When there were investigations into what happened during the elections and the influence campaigns. So indeed, Russians in their doctrines, they are actually perceiving information space as a space for actually active war waging. As I said before, it's not for trade or market of ideas. It's rather the place for influence. Whether the West is half asleep, I would say that there is a bigger realization that this might be a problem. So there are specific institutions in the European Union. There are a lot of new organizations that are trying to deal with that, to fight it, right? So GEC in the United States, similar agencies in France and some other countries as well that are dealing with that. So this is at least realization is happening, maybe somewhat delayed reaction, but it's still there, and hopefully it would ramp up. But we need to understand that again, the financing of these organizations is not to the up to the match what Russians are doing at all, right? So there are much more need to be done. So the countries need to learn more based on Ukrainian experience, right? So first of all, they need to start doing what Ukraine is already doing. It's basically heavily in cooperating with civil society organizations, because again, the problem of disinformation cannot be solved by a single government or single organization. There should be widespread coordination and cooperation, right? Creating this overlap that we discussed before simply, because to make it more robust effort. Second of all, there is an approach proposed by Ukrainian government that is called information Rammstein, like the military one that happens. So the idea is that not only to cooperate in how to deal with different actors in the malign actors in information space, but also to exchange ideas and tactics, like tactics of what Russians are doing and how to repel them. So basically sharing tips and tricks on how to be better and more efficient into countering Russian disinfo. Another thing is that yeah, I would say investigating Russian influence in within the countries. So what kind of organizations they support, how far-reaching this influence is, and if needed, just tagging these actors as cooperating with Russia, right? So again, naming and shaming and some other things that might be helpful. So there is a lot of things that should be done, but the most basic of all is understanding the real life risks that disinformation brings and effects that it might bring to democratic institutions like the elections, and basically simply react to it.
And from the research, from your conversations, and of course from your direct observation of the evolution of counter disinformation techniques, can we draw some conclusions already about what definitely doesn't work, what only works partially, and what is proving to be most successful in countering disinformation? I'm thinking here particularly as, in the early days of this process, fact checking, a lot of projects and technology focused on fact checking, that's proved to be relatively ineffective, and other techniques have evolved. But if you give a bit of an overview of the ecosystem and what is working well, what is working less well.
In many countries, monitoring and fact-checking considered extremely ineffective, that they are not working. But the problem is that this is the basics. And this is our first lesson, that the basics cannot be overlooked or omitted. Like simply without monitoring information space and understanding what is happening, what kind of messages Russians are disseminating, you do not know what to react to and how to counter it. And without fact-checking, you cannot literally destroy this message. You cannot literally react to it. So these things are essentials. I'm not saying that they alone are could solve the problem. That's definitely not the issue, right? You need to bring up more and more different approaches to this. You cannot simply think that if you monitor and debunk from time to time that you solve this problem. Absolutely not. So I would say this is essential, that should be done and continue to be done, maybe even implicated in a larger scale. But it by itself, it's not sufficient. The next step is actually investigating these actors, right, and trying to impose some punitive measures, right? So by the limiting reach and creating some obstacles for Russian disinformation actor to share their disinformation and attempts to influence foreign populations. Another thing is maybe understand that I would say what worked is this seemingly chaotic approach to the disinformation, right? So again, because you cannot match the Russian spending, to this. You need to be more flexible, creative, and more horizontal in your approach. So that actually worked in Ukraine. It seems from the outside, it seems like this is a chaotic system of some random actors that are interacting with each other from time to time. But this is actually what worked out pretty well. I don't know whether it is could be considered great because some societies are more inclined towards some more institutionalized approaches. They might also work, but in Ukraine, work more chaotic and slightly, I don't know, horizontal coordination between different actors. And maybe the thing that worked the best in countering disinfo, it's using humor, as we already discussed, right, as a tool to reach out to new audiences. That is extremely important to reach out to new people, but also to raise morale around people that you know. Another extremely crucial thing for the governmental agencies, but also for civil society as well. It is actually being at the platforms where your target audiences are. What I mean by this, up to 70+% of Ukrainian population consumes news from Telegram. And prior to large-scale invasion, Ukrainian agencies, like state agencies, went and created their Telegram accounts so that people could find out truthful and right information on the platform where they are. They will not go to your website and read news, most likely. They will read it when they and where they think it is more comfortable for them. So that's why you need to be there at the places where your people are. You need to understand your population, what they're interested, what kind of platforms they are using, and be there for them and provide the information. Understand that if you're not responding to some messages or situations quickly, the void would be filled by some disinfo and rumors that and Russia would likely exploit the situation.
And the last question here is that throughout this war, I've been quite finely tuned into Russian disinformation narratives. I have a sort of scrapbook of them. I make notes and try to, track their evolution. There are a lot of tools now that do this quite effectively as well. And then when you go back and look at the mainstream media, now this isn't to tarnish all of the media because there are some absolutely fantastic, experienced journalists out there, working in the media, and Ukraine has an extraordinary set of journalists in Kiev Independent and other outlets as well. But if you look at the whole the mass-produced media, there seem to be either sort of sloppy or ambiguous or downright disingenuous titles of articles and even content over and over and over again, where it's clear that propagandistic narratives have influenced the framing of the language in those. I'm thinking particularly around the Kakhovka Dam, for instance, and more recently the downing of the transport plane, the Ilyushin, where almost immediately and for many days afterwards, most media outlets, including BBC, Times Radio, and many others, were saying plane down with 65 prisoners of war on board, even though there is no proof whatsoever, and that so-called fact was something released by the Russian government, a government that is a pathological liar and proven to be such. What needs to be done to make the media response or inoculate the media far better against propagandistic narratives than is currently the case?
That's a fantastic question, and I guess a lot of people wanted to know the answer to it. I'll try to get my take on that, but I by no means this is like conclusive thing, right? This is indeed a problem, and for Ukrainians, it's quite painful. You probably see maybe a few Twitter storms of Ukrainians that are not extremely happy about this kind of headlines. So what should be done here is that better understanding of the region. We should start from here, right? So what you said, Russia has proven track record of lying on record. So there should be some asterisks about it when you cite Russian government. It should not be taken at the plain value as a like absolutely truthful and great information that you should use in your media. So there should always be some kind of disclaimer that these actors like consistently lied to us multiple times with, I don't know, MH17 and some other things. So be cautious about it. I would say, again, media works under great pressure, and a lot of the time I believe that there are just no way like in time to make a better and more weight decision, right? So but when they are publishing articles, they need to understand that what they are writing in the about the war or specific like other conflict zones might actually influence what's happening on the ground. So more sensitivity towards understanding what is happening and what kind of their words could lead to, that would actually be helpful in this case, in my humble opinion. But again, I don't know whether you agree or disagree with these things.
I think there are multiple things there, and of course the economics of modern media are very much not in favor of the kind of robustness and training and indeed local context and knowledge that would be required. Obviously, that that those are all skills that require investment, which is just not there in the kind of copy paste environment of the bulk of content output. So that's the real challenge there. Now, I know we've sort of run out of time here. I think there is a ton of stuff we can still talk about. So I'm very much hoping we get the chance to speak again and explore, other research that's being done by the digital forensic unit that you're part of and the kind of research papers. But Roman, I'm really grateful that you spent time to share that with the audience. We'll put a link to your report in the description of the video. I think it's really useful for people to check that out and look at the full detail there of the recommended methodologies for countering disinformation that you outline.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a great pleasure talking to you and discussing the report and other findings and implications.